special guest, Mr. Bret Stephens from New York City.
What's intimidating is to follow these two superb speeches. I just want to thank Fred personally. I'm here simply because Fred wrote me an extremely nice letter, and he was persistent, and it was just very hard to turn him down. I also have, it happens in a weird way that Ottawa is the site of one of my nicest childhood memories. Because when I was a child, my father had the idea of taking his two sons to Algonquin Provincial Park for father-son bonding experiences, which were disastrous. And so coming out of the Nipissing River in Ottawa was the first civilization we encountered. And I have a memory of what for years was the greatest meal of my life, which was at a restaurant which I thought, my brother and I thought was hilariously named. Only later did we learn that the name was actually Mother Tucker's. You know, when you've been eating freeze-dried food for a week, Mother Tucker's is a wonderful place. I don't know if it's still around, but so I'm gonna have to find it. So at any rate, I really want to sort of organize my speech around three distinct memories, and hopefully something thematic will emerge. On September 11th, 2001, I was an editorial writer for the Wall Street Journal, and I was based in Brussels. Although our offices in New York, where I had previously worked, were in the World Financial Center right across the street from the Twin Towers. So I used to walk through the Twin Towers every single day on my way to work. And it happened that on 9/11, I was flying from my then home base in Brussels to Jerusalem to interview Benjamin Netanyahu, who was then a couple of years out of office. The Intifada, the second Intifada, had already begun by then, and I was covering Israel and the conflict intensively. And I learned of the attacks the moment I landed at Ben Gurion Airport. In fact, the first time I think the ladies behind the windows at immigration at Ben Gurion were ever nice to me was on September 11th, because they said to me, "Oh, the plane has just hit the towers." I drove from the airport straight up to the home of a friend of mine who lived in a bedroom community near Jerusalem called Mevaseret, and it was in Mevaseret that we watched the towers come down on TV. Of course, this was very anxious because I had dozens of colleagues who were just across the street in the World Financial Center, and it was only later that we learned that none of them had been hurt, although some had very, very close calls. Anyway, that evening, because there I was in Jerusalem, my interview with Bibi had, of course, been canceled. I thought, well, I'm a journalist, so I'm going to go do my job. So I wandered through the streets of East and West Jerusalem, talking to people and getting their reactions. And it was a very striking time to be there, a very striking evening, because as you wandered from one side to the other, and I knew Palestinians who lived in East Jerusalem and the environs, you just encountered two utterly distinct worlds. I mean, there was a sense of devastation in West Jerusalem, not only because so many West Jerusalemites have friends and family in New York City, including some who were killed in the towers, but just the sense that here was a great ally of the state of Israel, and it had just been devastated. And across the way, it was impossible not to report the fact that there was an ill-disguised sense of total jubilation in the streets of East Jerusalem that had only been suppressed by a diktat from the then Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, not to openly celebrate. But there were open celebrations in Beirut, really throughout the entire Arab world. And anyone who denies this simply wasn't there, or is lying to someone else, or is lying to themselves. So what struck me when I was there was the sense that the idea that this was just a collection of 19 guys who got on a plane and were connected to a small, isolated sect, Islamist sect, was just simply not true. These people were emerging from a culture that even if it, most 99% of the people I encountered would not have themselves participated in, they were cheering it, they were celebrating it, and there was no turning away from that fact. So from the very beginning, and at the time I was 27 years old, you became very conscious that the phrase clash of civilizations really applied, and Jerusalem literally sat on the fault line of that crash. Now it also happened, and I think this is important, that when I was, as I flew to Jerusalem on that flight, I took with me a book that I was then reading for the second time, and that's a book called The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. And I don't know if some of you, I'm sure in this room, have read it. If you haven't, you really, before you die, read The Magic Mountain. The sooner the better, because you never know. But it's a wonderful book, and I had read it, I guess, right out of college. It's the story of a young man. It takes place, the action begins around 1907. And it takes place in a tuberculosis sanatorium in the town of Davos, which is now famous for the annual World Economic Forum conference, which takes place there. But at the time, it was considered that high altitudes, cold, thin air was good for tuberculosis. This was the era before antibiotics, so it was untreatable at the time. And so wealthy consumptives, as tuberculosis patients were known, would try to take the cure in these large sanatoriums in places like Davos. So the action takes place in Davos, and the first time I'd read it as a kind of a coming-of-age novel, because the hero is this young man named Hans Castorp, who's sort of finding his way, and he decides to take a 7-year vacation from life on this magic mountain. This time I was reading it again, I was a little bit older, and what really struck me was the philosophical core of the novel, which is an extended debate. It goes on for hundreds of pages, really, between these two characters. And one character is this humanist. He's an Italian humanist. His name in the book is Ludovico Settembrini, and he's kind of like, he's like a Canadian socialist. He believes that progress is happening and humanity is coming together and the world is becoming a better place, and that civilization is softening the manners of men and leading us inexorably to this kind of soft utopia. And Settembrini is a very interesting character because he's not simply an idiot. I mean, he's really a philosophically very astute character. He makes a tremendous impression on the young hero of the book, Hans Castorp. And set against him is this other character who is a lapsed Jesuit priest, a guy by the name of Leo Nafta. And Nafta is, in a sense, he's a kind of an avatar for all of the totalitarian movements that would follow in the 20th century. And there's a wonderful line in which Nafta sort of expresses the core of his view. He says, "It is a cruel misunderstanding of youth to imagine that at the heart of desire is the desire to be free. The heart of desire is the desire to obey." And it's a very important line because it makes kind of a fundamental philosophical contention. You were talking earlier about the importance of this culture. We have this culture of freedom. But we know, and every day we come across people for whom that culture of freedom is, for one reason or another, terrifying, dismaying. They are in flight from freedom, and what they really want is some kind of culture of obedience. And so this is sort of Settembrini's, Nafta's argument for essentially totalitarianism. That totalitarianism speaks in its own way to deeper recesses of the human heart than the Western political tradition, enlightened political tradition, does. And it explains why in 1953, when Stalin died, why the people of the Soviet Union wept. People who had been terrorized for 25 straight years, they wept. And some of that weeping was unquestionably sincere. So I'm reading this novel, really, which is this argument between this kind of soft liberalism and this hard, deep, almost Gnostic totalitarianism. And there I am, and I land in Jerusalem, and these events take place. And so it made this enormous impression. Now, the novel ends in an interesting way, and I don't think I'm giving away the genius of the novel by giving away the conclusion, or the near conclusion, before the young hero goes and joins the German army and dies in some ditch somewhere. Which is that Settembrini and NAFTA, for most of the novel, this argument between them is carried out as a kind of a conversation, a spirited debate between worthy intellectual partners. But as things go on, it becomes angrier and angrier. And at the end, NAFTA challenges Settembrini to a duel. And it's one of the great scenes in Western literature. And what happens in the duel is the two men face off, pistols at however many paces, right? And they have their seconds. And Settembrini is given the chance to take the first shot, and instead of firing at his adversary, NAFTA, he fires the gun in the air. And NAFTA, now with the ability to shoot Settembrini, puts the gun to his own head and commits suicide. And I've always read that. Thomas Mann wrote this book in the 1920s, by which time Leninism was entrenched in Russia and Mussolini was in Italy. I read this as Mann's understanding that the confrontation that mattered most in the world, the philosophical confrontation that mattered most in the world, was between, on the one hand, a soft liberalism that did not have the moral resources at the decisive moment to defend itself against a mortal enemy, against a totalitarian adversary that for all of its evil and all of its will to power would ultimately be undermined and undone by a fundamental psychology of nihilism, which is why NAFTA's life ends in suicide. And there's an argument to be made that if you look at the great confrontations in 20th century, now 21st century history, they follow this pattern of a soft liberalism that doesn't quite have the resources to defend itself, and then finds itself confronted by an enemy that does us the favor of committing suicide at some point. And in fact, that's exactly what happened between the West and the Soviet Union. And people say, oh, Reagan won this,